Hi, welcome to The Good Neighbors. I'm your host, Ari Toole, and today we'll be talking about sex and consent. So it is for mature audiences. We'll be interviewing Lilah Rose today. If you want to introduce yourself.
All right. It's a pleasure to be here. I am an educator and advocate for disabilities and consent and sexuality and communication and kind of all of the things in that area.
It's so important.
Yeah, I'm definitely passionate about helping people understand these things and living better lives by being able to interact with each other in healthier ways.
Definitely. Yeah, that's so important. I can't wait to ask you more about that on the second segment. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
So welcome to 2020. Coyote has plans for a busy legislative session. Coyote is in support of the following bills that may change their number, but the substance will stay the same. We approach legislative work by supporting our community partners with their campaigns and supporting efforts and also efforts of sex workers. Policies that Coyote has worked with directly. H5354, creating a special legislative commission to study the health and safety impact of revising commercial sexual activity laws. S0317 and H5733, establishing criteria for the criminal offense of sexual assault when the victim is in custody of a police officer and making it a felony with minimum 3-year imprisonment. Senator Sam Bell will be reintroducing this bill in 2020. Policies that our community partners are leading, but also impact sex workers in our community at large. Coyote is supporting the reclassifying drug possession to a misdemeanor. That's Bill H5760 and S0472. Coyote is supporting the Fair License Campaign, H5863, that was launched by DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, Behind the Walls Committee. Coyote supports H5125, the Reproductive Privacy Act. Next, I would like to inform everyone on Representative Williams, who will be holding a press release at the State House on March 3rd at 3:30. March 3rd is International Sex Worker Rights Day, to announce the reintroducing of the House resolution creating a legislative study commission to study the health and safety impacts of revising Rhode Island commercial sex laws. We are asking our community and our allies to show up with us in support of sex workers and their health and their safety. We'll meet at 3:30 on March 3rd in the House Lodge. Thank you so much. We hope to see you there. Hi, welcome back. Now we're going to interview our guest, Lilah Rose, on consent. And I just wanted to start off with a definition. What is good consent?
So consent is when you enter an agreement with another person to a specific activities, person or people. That's a very kind of that's the dictionary definition, but good consent, to get high quality consent that stands up to scrutiny, it needs to be mutual. That's fairly straightforward. Everyone involved needs to be consenting. It needs to be, I'll come back and define these, but mutual, active, informed, sober, timely, and uncoerced. Okay. And that's like a whole bunch of adjectives thrown in there, but I'll go back. Active means that it has to last through the entire interaction. For interpersonal consent, you must be able to withdraw your consent at any time before or during the interaction. So if at any point someone revokes their consent,
Right.
not only do they have the right to do that, but it means that anything after that point no longer has active consent. And so your consent is invalid, and anything after that is assault or harassment, or, in a really bad situation, if it were sexual, it'd be rape. For consent to be informed, everyone involved has to understand and be on the same page about what's going to happen. Because we're not mind readers. Often we have different interpretations of what
Right.
something might mean. It also means understanding the risks involved. When we're talking sexually, this usually means whether or not barriers are going to be used, like condoms, whether or not birth control is, whether people are on birth control or not, and also STI status. So these are all things that inform whether or not someone's giving consent in an informed way. Sober is really important,
Right.
because in order to give good quality consent, you have to be in a sober frame of mind. Your judgment can't be impaired. And for this, I'm not just talking about alcohol or even other substances that impair judgment, but being in an extremely heightened emotional state often has the same effects as being on chemical
Yeah.
drugs
Right. Yeah, that's
that
such a
might
good
affect
reminder.
you. And so really taking into account what is the situation, and is this person able to make decisions in a sober frame of mind. Timely, sort of similar to active, but timely means that consent is given for discrete periods of time. If you agree to do something once, that does not mean you are then agreeing to do it
Right.
for any number of times in the future. That consent expires at the end, and then you need to get new consent in order to have good consent for the next time. When we talk about models of consent, there is something known as ongoing consent, but it has to be negotiated specifically.
Yeah, that's important.
And lastly, and probably most importantly, uncoerced. If there is coercion at work, then you cannot give valid consent. And this one can be really tricky because most people think of overt or active coercion,
Yeah.
or something that is really obvious, like violence.
Right, right.
And that is a really easy case of being able to define it, but very often it's not nearly so overt. And it doesn't have to be active coercion. No one has to be actually working to make someone feel coerced.
Yeah.
It's often passive, and that is the situation surrounding the interaction and the power dynamics involved. So this is, a professor might not feel like he's coercing a student, but because there is an inherent power dynamic, and
Right.
someone can expect that if I say no, there will be negative repercussions.
Definitely. Yeah.
There's coercion at work. It's a
Yeah.
coercive situation.
Yeah, I feel like work is the same way. If you're an employer and you don't maybe necessarily think that you're coercing your employee, it's still there's that power dynamic.
Absolutely, and I think that there are also a lot of people who don't recognize that their interpersonal behavior was coercive, but that someone on the receiving end feels coerced. So
Yeah.
this might be when your partner's constantly asking you, like, hey, can we have sex? And
Yeah.
you say no, and they're like, well, what about now? And
Yeah.
eventually you say yes, because otherwise that's the only way to get them to stop. That is coercive.
Right.
But we often don't think of it that way.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you can feel, especially in a loving relationship, it's hard to not feel guilt when you are saying no. Do you want to talk about the guilt that comes along with that and how to
Yes.
say no?
We are not taught how to establish good boundaries, especially as people who are raised female or who are women.
Yeah.
It's very culturally difficult to establish strong boundaries, and people who do often, earn the label of bitch for,
Right.
Which I always use as a woman with strong boundaries. But being able to outright say no not only is difficult because we don't have any practice with it, and communication takes practice, it also can be really dangerous, and many people have seen how negatively people react when they are told no, and absorb that and learn that saying no puts them in a dangerous situation.
Right.
And I mean, we can see this even that it is so common for typically men to get so upset about being rejected that they kill a woman who has rejected them, that police have a term for this. It's called rejection killings.
Right.
So this fear of if you say no, what's going to happen is very valid.
Yeah.
And we really need to address that when we're looking at consent, because if someone doesn't feel comfortable saying no, then how can their yes be valid, and how can people enable no to be something that can be communicated so everyone feels better about the situation?
Right, definitely, yeah. I feel like, not only do we have to learn, healthy ways to say no, but also like healthy ways to hear no, and how to not take that no personally, and how to just take consent as something that's really normal. And a lot of people feel like, it may not be like, attractive or like sexy in a certain situation to use consent. Do you want to talk about ways to
oh my goodness.
Yeah, to bring it up?
So first thing I wanted to say is, even if someone does take it personally, to nonetheless respect that this isn't their fault. That's
a good point.
The offense they're taking is a them problem, not the problem of the person who's setting boundaries. So I have so many people who have told me that, like, but consent, like getting affirmative consent isn't sexy. Like, you just want to like jump into the moment and go with the flow, and, which is understandable, and especially that's the model that we see in all of media, and so that's what we understand as being the sexy way to get your thing on, as it were. I personally feel that consent and getting consent and giving consent is an incredibly erotic and a huge turn on for me. Because essentially what I see it as is, if someone is asking me for my consent to kiss me, to hold my hand, basically what they're telling me is that they respect me so much and they are so interested in how I feel about them that they want to make sure that I am interested and engaged, and they want to hear my yes and respect it. Yeah,
I totally agree. I feel like there's nothing, there's nothing like hotter than someone being like, hey, like, can I do this? And then you being like, like, I would love if you did this. Or maybe like, no, what I really like is for you to do this. Or like,
absolutely.
I feel like even if you're like, consenting to, in a sexual context, it could be like, to certain things, but then not to other acts. And especially for like trans bodies, I feel like you constantly have to be like checking in, or like, trauma survivors. And did you want to talk a little bit about like consent, nonverbal and also verbal?
Yes. So there are lots of different models of consent. The one that we all learned and is luckily starting to die in some places is no means no. And no means no is like the bottom of the barrel, obvious. Like, but obviously there are a lot of situations in which someone either can't or doesn't say no. But that doesn't mean that they've consented.
Exactly.
So a lot of people are moving to yes means yes, and that is so much better in so many ways. But there are still a lot of situations, especially when there is a situational coercion involved, where someone's yes might not actually be a good consensual yes. So one thing that people are currently is yes means yes is good, and even more than yes means yes, we want enthusiastic consent. So this is when there is no question that the person you are talking to is saying this because they feel they need to, when like their enthusiasm is palpable. They're not like, okay, they're like, yes, let's do this.
Yeah, definitely.
But I also want to say that that is not the only valid model of consent. And there are many situations in which consent can still be valid even if it's not. If it's someone you're just getting to know, if it's a new partner, if you're doing something new, then enthusiastic consent is the safest and the best way to make sure that what's going on is consensual. I said earlier I was going to touch on ongoing or blanket consent. And this is when you negotiate that I am saying yes to do this activity, and from any point now into the future, you can assume that unless I then say no, that I mean yes. So, you know, when you're in a relationship with someone, at a certain point, you expect that you don't need to ask for consent before kissing or hugging, and that's blanket consent. And most people move into it very naturally, but having that explicit, because there are some things that even if you're in a relationship with, like, no, we need to talk about that. I am not always in the mood for that.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like it changes so like day to day too for some people.
Yeah, and again, it's for me, I interpret it as a gesture of respect. Even if we do have a blanket consent, sometimes my partner still asks me like, are you in the mood for this? Do you
Right.
And
especially if it seems maybe not as enthusiastic or something. It's nice to have that check-in.
Right, or even, you know, like, well, why are you saying it? Are you saying this to this because, and the one other kind of consent that is actually fairly controversial is transactional consent. And this comes up a lot with sex work. And there are a lot of people who say that sex work can't be consensual because transactional consent is invalid. I feel that that is a little ridiculous because there's no other realm of consent, because consent is present in every part of our lives, legally, materially, vocationally, socially. In every single one of those, transactional consent is valid. So it's also valid as sexual transactional consent. So long as all of the other things about being mutual and active and informed, sober, timely, and coerced apply, then yes. And then body language. So verbal, or whether you're signing or using some sort of formalized language, is safe. A lot of people like to use body language, and that's not invalid, but it's dangerous to rely on. Because either to say no or to say yes, there are a lot of people who don't intuitively pick up on body language signs. And relying on them having that knowledge and awareness can get you in a lot of trouble from either end. Either like, I am trying to make it clear to them that I'm super interested.
That's so funny. And I feel like that's something that can also be like talked about thoroughly ahead of time. You know, if you are going to use more of those nonverbal communications, like to make it really clear, like I know, one friend who like feels uncomfortable hearing their own voice like in sexual interactions, so they need like, you know, nonverbal like, you know, things, and that is really, really valid, but you have to make that clear, and then, you know, as the person who is like who's with them, you have to kind of like really be aware and be on the lookout of those signs.
Like paying attention to those. Definitely. And there are many, many great ways that you can incorporate that. And it is, to be able to communicate on that nonverbal level is pretty hot. And being able to have these frank conversations makes it, you're not sitting there going, I think they're enjoying what I'm doing, but I'm not sure. I guess I'll keep doing it. But have the conversation, say, yes, I loved that. Next time, you know, if you move half an inch to the right, I will love it even more. And
I know, and I feel like it's scary to bring that into the conversation, because like you said, we're not always taught that, like, you know, at schools and different things like that. So it's important to kind of like educate yourself, but also maybe like educate the person you're with, and like.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really important to educate people about consent is it's not something we're taught.
Yeah.
It's kind of assumed that we'll absorb it, but we don't have any good models to follow, just like there's no good models for getting consent being sexy. And I mean, again, for me, like that's the craziest thing, because someone looking at like deep into my eyes, clearly adoring me and asking if it would be okay if, you know, we did whatever activity was in mind, like that's hot to me.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, and not only aren't we taught good, you know, consent or good communication skills, this is especially when it comes to talking about sex.
Yeah, totally.
That is so terrifying to so many people, because it's still such an awkward and taboo subject. And I need to remind myself of this because I spend my entire life, you know,
bringing conversation,
talking about sex to people. But it is really terrifying.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I feel like a lot of people are still really uncomfortable to have these conversations around sex, which just makes it harder to then have safe sex.
Right, because I have a bit of there's a quote I learned is if you're not comfortable talking about sex, you're probably not ready to have the sex. And if you think about, well, what are the repercussions of talking about sex, like embarrassment or, you know, rejection or feeling uncomfortable? Okay, those are risks you take.
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences of not talking about what you're doing? And those consequences are far, far higher. You or your partner can be really severely traumatized.
Definitely.
And a lot of harm and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of situations in which one partner walks away going, that was amazing, I loved it, it was wonderful. And the other partner who walks away completely traumatized and never wanting to interact with that person again, and without having communication there.
Yeah.
It's causes a lot of ongoing problems, and if the partner who walks away thinking it was wonderful never learns that no, in fact, they can't change their behavior for the future. So, and with that said, it's not the person who was harmed.
Right.
It's not something they're not required, or they shouldn't be expected to have to educate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do you have, that's such a good point, do you have like tips on where you can go, like how you can learn more tips and how to teach yourself?
If you have access to the internet, Googling good consent practices brings up a lot of really good articles. The Center for Nonviolent Communication has really good tips on how to communicate in healthy ways. I also, for people who are still really, really nervous about talking about sex, find someone who isn't.
Yeah.
And you may have to pay them for your time, and it will be worth it.
Yep.
And have conversations. And you know, there are lots of people who will sit you down and like, oh, well, you're too awkward to get started. That's fine. Tell me about your favorite sexual position and what are your fantasies.
Yeah.
And normalizing those conversations can really help your sex life, your entire life together, and your consent practices immensely.
Yeah, I love that. That's so important. Yes. I'm just going to scroll to see if there's any other questions that I missed, because I probably did. Yeah, did you want to touch upon this? You know, sometimes I feel like, sometimes people say no, you know, if they mean yes, or did you want to touch upon that and how?
So, how much do we have? Okay. Yeah. Really quickly. Historically, it has been women and people raised female have been taught that they're not allowed to say yes to sex. That makes them a slut. That makes them, you know, whatever, all of those nonsense things. So there's developed this playing coy where, like, well, I'm expected to say no, but I really mean yes, and that kind of trying to say yes within the confines of not being allowed to.
Right.
And so I've had people ask me, say, like, well, what if I do if that's what they're doing? And the answer is, if someone says no, no matter what their reason is, no matter if they're trying to say yes, if they say no, that means no.
Yeah.
And you can say, I'm going to respect what you've said to me and your no. I'm getting missed messages, but that's what I heard and that's what I'm going to respect. Let me know if you change your mind.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to touch on is for people who want to make it easier, who know that their partners are people who have difficulty saying no or have been conditioned that saying no is dangerous, saying, would you like to insert activity here?
Yeah.
It's okay if you say no.
Yeah, I love that.
Is such a huge thing. Giving that permission
Yeah.
not only reminds someone that that's an option, because a lot of times we have this situation where like, I have to say, like you forget that you can say no.
Totally. No, totally.
It also indicates that if you say no, that person is already prepared for that answer and isn't going to get upset.
Yeah.
They may be sad, but they're willing to hear and willing to respect those boundaries.
I love that. That's so important. And I feel like it's also, it's like, it's okay to say no and say no and say no and like, keep saying no. I feel like there's also this pressure where once you said no once, maybe you should say yes this time because you said no last time. I just feel like, you can really stick to that. And like you said, if you have a partner that understands, then they'll do those check-ins and they'll make sure that you're feeling comfortable. And if they don't, then why are they your partner? Like you have to check in and maybe they have some growing to do before, like you said, you can be sexually intimate with someone.
Yeah, and learning these practices together is something I've seen a lot of people do. And
you're so right.
Also laughing, like this doesn't all have to be extremely serious. Like underneath it is very serious, but you can joke some humor in, like, especially if you're feeling awkward.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you so much.
Of course, Annette, thank you for being here.
May I shake your hand?
Please.
It was a pleasure.
I consent to the handshake. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Please come March 3rd to support at the State House.